Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty interesting.
Yeah,
And I'm really curious to get your take on this.
absolutely.
We're going to be talking about the potential impact of a second Trump presidency on cannabis reform.
Okay.
Now, this is really interesting because, we saw some things during his first term that make us wonder,
Hmm.
what his real stance on cannabis is.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you've got these campaign signals that suggest that he's supportive of rescheduling cannabis.
Right.
But then on the other hand, his actions during his first term raise questions about how committed he really is to,
Yeah,
any kind of meaningful reform.
for sure.
So I guess the big question here is, what does all of this mean
Yeah.
for the cannabis industry, for individual rights, and for, the push for real change when it comes to cannabis policy?
Well, it's really fascinating to see how these political strategies and actual policy changes kind of interact with each other.
Right.
To really understand what cannabis reform might look like under another Trump administration, we need to look at both his words and his past actions.
Okay, so let's start with this rescheduling thing, because I think that's probably top of mind for a lot of people.
Sure.
If cannabis were to be moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, what would that actually change in a practical sense?
So rescheduling to Schedule 3 would mean that the government officially recognizes cannabis as having medical value,
Okay.
but with a lower potential for abuse than substances that are in Schedule 1 or 2.
Right.
And this is important because it could open the door for more research into cannabis's potential benefits,
Yeah,
which has been really limited because of its current Schedule 1 status.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing it could also loosen some of the legal restrictions on cannabis businesses, right?
Yeah, absolutely. A huge potential benefit for the industry would be getting rid of the IRS Code Section 280E tax burden.
Okay, can you break that down for us a little bit?
Yeah, so this code basically prevents cannabis businesses from deducting normal business expenses, which puts them at a significant financial disadvantage compared to other industries.
That's crazy.
It's kind of like running a restaurant, but not being able to write off the cost of food or rent.
Right.
It just doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't. So for companies like TrueLeave, which is, a pretty big player in the cannabis world,
Sure.
this could mean big tax refunds and a real boost to their growth.
Yeah, exactly. But we also need to remember that while rescheduling could be great for businesses,
Yeah.
it doesn't automatically translate into help for individuals who have been caught up in the war on drugs.
Right. It's not a magic bullet.
Right.
It's not going to solve all the problems.
Exactly.
Rescheduling might not do much for people with criminal records, for example,
Yeah.
or those who are fighting for social equity.
Exactly.
So it's a step forward, but it's definitely not the end of the road.
I agree.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Trump's past actions.
Yeah.
Because, like we said, it's been a bit of a mixed bag.
Sure.
We saw the legalization of hemp production with the 2018 Farm Bill, which was a positive step.
Yes.
But then there was the dismantling of the Cole Memorandum,
Right.
which had protected state legal cannabis businesses from federal prosecution.
Yeah, and it's important for our listeners to understand what that meant for the industry.
Okay.
The Cole Memo essentially gave state legal cannabis businesses a level of comfort knowing that the feds wouldn't interfere.
Right.
But when it was rescinded, it created a lot of uncertainty and risk for those businesses.
For sure. And let's not forget the proposed budget cuts to medical cannabis programs.
Right, so there's this disconnect between Trump's current pro-cannabis talk and what his administration actually did in the past.
Right.
Which raises the question, has he genuinely changed his mind about cannabis? Or is this just a political move because public opinion on cannabis has shifted so much?
It's hard to say for sure, but, as you mentioned, we have to look at who else might be influencing cannabis policy in a potential second Trump administration.
Yeah.
There's been some talk about Matt Gaetz,
Yeah.
a congressman who supports cannabis as a possible attorney general.
Right. Gates's potential appointment is definitely interesting.
Yeah.
His stance on cannabis could have a real impact on how federal law enforcement deals with state legal cannabis businesses,
Okay.
maybe leading to less interference.
That could be a good thing.
Yeah.
But even if someone like Gaetz is in a key position, can we really expect big changes given the current political climate?
That's a good point.
I mean, there are some powerful figures in the GOP who have opposed cannabis reform for years.
Yeah, that's true. we can't expect one appointment to change everything.
Right.
We also need to consider someone like John Thune, who's likely to be the Senate Majority Leader and has a history of opposing cannabis reform.
Right.
And this kind of highlights the tension between the bipartisan support for things like the Safe Banking Act,
Yeah.
which would allow cannabis businesses to use banks, and the resistance from some parts of the Republican Party.
It's a complicated situation with a lot of different viewpoints.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember the bigger picture here. Cannabis reform should be about more than just business.
Right.
It should be about individual rights.
Yes.
And fixing the harm caused by decades of prohibition.
I agree. Focusing only on helping the cannabis industry get bigger without addressing the social injustices caused by the war on drugs
Right.
isn't enough.
It's not enough.
Real reform needs to include things like expunging criminal records,
Yeah.
giving people back the right to grow their own cannabis freely, and making sure that marginalized communities that were hit hardest by prohibition get a fair chance.
One thing that I find concerning about a possible second Trump administration is the potential for more militarization, especially when it comes to border enforcement and going after cartels.
Yeah, this brings up an important question. Does using the military to fight drugs, especially against cartels, really work?
Yeah.
And what are the consequences of that approach?
Right.
And I think this is actually quite problematic.
Right.
First, cartels have largely moved away from cannabis production because of legalization, making it less of a target for them.
Like second, using the military doesn't address the root causes of substance use or the harm caused by criminalization.
It's kind of like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. You're just making the problem worse.
Right. And experts like Jeffrey Miron from Harvard and the Cato Institute argue that the best way to fight cartels and reduce drug-related violence is legalization, not militarization.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Miron's argument shows how contradictory it is to use military force to solve a problem that legalization could largely fix.
Yay.
What's more, spending money on militarization takes away resources from proven harm reduction strategies that actually work to reduce overdoses and improve public health.
Yeah.
This kind of approach just continues an outdated and ineffective way of thinking that focuses on punishment instead of practical solutions.
So are we really trying to solve the complex problems around cannabis, or are this making things worse with these outdated policies?
That's the real question we need to ask ourselves if we want to move forward.
Yeah, we need to honestly look at our priorities and commit to using evidence-based solutions that put public health, individual rights, and social justice ahead of punishments that have clearly failed in the past.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
We need to be smart about this.
Absolutely.
We need to be compassionate.
Yes.
And we need to focus on solutions that actually work.
I agree.
All right, well, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue our deep dive into the potential impact of a second Trump presidency on cannabis reform.
Sounds good. So, going back to this whole rescheduling thing, even if it's not a perfect solution for everyone,
Right.
it would still be a significant change for cannabis businesses.
For sure. For sure. I mean, you're talking about a whole different financial landscape for a lot of these companies.
Absolutely. One of the most important changes would be getting rid of IRS Code Section 280E.
Right, which we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
That could be a game changer.
It really could, because as it stands now, cannabis businesses are basically being punished by the tax code.
Yeah, they can't deduct normal business expenses like other industries can.
Exactly. They have to pay taxes on their total income instead of their profit,
Right.
which puts them at a real disadvantage.
Huge disadvantage.
Rescheduling to Schedule the Third would remove that unfair burden and could lead to some companies getting big tax refunds.
Oh, yeah.
Which would obviously boost their profits.
We've already seen companies like TrueLeaf preparing for this potential change.
Yes.
They've been pretty vocal about it.
Yeah, TrueLeaf has said they could get over $100 million in tax refunds if rescheduling happens.
Wow.
That shows you just how big of a financial impact this could have.
That's huge.
It's a major reason why the industry is pushing for this change.
Okay, so even with rescheduling, though, there is still the issue of banking access,
Right.
which is a huge obstacle for a lot of these businesses.
Absolutely.
The Safe Banking Act has been going through Congress trying to fix this, right?
That's right. The Safe Banking Act is really important because it would finally allow cannabis businesses to use banks like any other business.
Yeah.
Right now, most banks are afraid to work with cannabis companies.
Because of the federal regulation.
Exactly. They're worried about getting in trouble with the federal government.
Right.
So this forces a lot of these businesses to operate with cash.
Which is not ideal.
Which is not only inefficient, but also dangerous.
Absolutely. So rescheduling and passing the Safe Banking Act would essentially make the financial environment for the cannabis industry much more stable and legitimate.
Exactly. However, it's important to acknowledge that even though these measures would greatly benefit the industry,
Yeah.
they're mainly focused on the economic side of reform.
Right. And we can't let the focus on profits make us forget about the need for a more comprehensive approach to cannabis reform.
Absolutely.
It needs to be about more than just money.
While economic growth in the cannabis industry is important, it shouldn't come at the expense of addressing the social injustices that have been caused by decades of prohibition.
Absolutely.
We have to remember the people and communities that have been disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs.
So true cannabis reform has to go beyond just creating a profitable industry.
Yes.
It needs to include measures that address criminal justice reform, ensure social equity,
Yeah.
and give people back their freedom.
You're absolutely right. We need to see reforms that prioritize expunging criminal records for nonviolent cannabis offenses,
Yes.
reinvesting in communities that have been harmed by the war on drugs, and creating a system that is more equitable and just for everyone.
It's about making sure that the benefits of cannabis legalization reach everyone, not just those at the top of the industry.
Exactly. It's about correcting past wrongs and creating a future where cannabis is treated fairly and responsibly.
You know, it seems like we keep coming back to this idea of balance.
Yeah.
You know, finding that sweet spot between business interests and social justice, between economic growth and individual rights.
For sure. That's a lot to juggle.
It really is. And I think it's important to remember that,
Yeah.
you know, the cannabis plant itself has a rich history and value that goes beyond just the money or the politics.
Absolutely.
I think sometimes we get so caught up in the legal battles and the financial side of things
Right.
that we forget that for a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's also about personal freedom and spiritual exploration.
Right.
This is a plant that has been used for medicine, recreation, and spiritual purposes for centuries.
For sure, reducing it to just a product ignores its cultural and historical significance.
Absolutely. And I think there's a depth there
Yeah.
that deserves to be respected.
Absolutely.
You know, it's about recognizing the plant's diverse uses and benefits and ensuring that individuals have the right to cultivate and use cannabis responsibly
Right.
without, you know, unnecessary government interference.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial point. True cannabis reform has to include not only economic and social justice, but also individual liberty
Right.
and the right to personal autonomy.
You know, I think that as we try to make sense of this complicated world of cannabis policy, we need to keep all of these perspectives in mind.
Yeah.
And we need to fight for reforms that benefit everyone,
I agree.
not just the corporations and the politicians,
Right.
but also the individuals, the communities,
Yeah.
and even the plant itself.
That's a powerful way to put it.
Yeah.
The future of cannabis reform really depends on our ability to balance economic growth with social equity, individual rights, and a respect for the plant's inherent value.
It's a challenge.
It is. It's a complex challenge, but it's one that we need to face head on.
For sure.
If we truly want to create a more just and equitable world for cannabis.
Well said. And to our listeners, I hope this deep dive has given you some new insights and things to think about.
Me too.
The fight for cannabis reform isn't over,
It's not.
and your voice matters.
It really does.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.